invitation. It just, I don't even remember when the email came months ago asking about some of the needs down at the Borderlands and the possibility of some people maybe coming down to our trained crisis counselors, which is all welcome. And then when I looked at the address of where Father Daniel is, we had a family wedding last night here in Leesburg, so that's how we ended up here. So this is great. I want to assure you that even though we live in far west Texas, we're not Houston Astro fans.
Viva that!
So, although I was born and raised in Chicago, so I'm a big Cubs fan, but we had our glory days a few years ago. And Chicago's a place where we say any team can have a bad century.
So if the Cubs can do it, the Nats.
That's right, exactly.
But
So,
yeah, you'd be shooed out of here if you weren't Astros.
the other,
Down girl.
yeah. The other thing that Susan and I are very grateful for, we worship, there are 5 churches that I oversee in the Borderlands, and the church that I'm at every Sunday, we just had our organist after 28 years retire, which might not seem like a big deal here, but in far west Texas, there are no organists. They're few and far between. So it's such a joy to hear the music and to sing with the piano, because we make a joyful noise in Marfa, Texas, singing a cappella. So thank you for being here. This is such a joy. This is an amazing congregation that we just appreciate a good deal. I'd like to begin with a prayer that we say at the Borderlands most any time we do some sort of ministry or outreach. So let us pray. Dear God, every day children, women, and men are making the perilous journey north to the U.S. border, a border established by people, not by you. May we always be curious about what is beyond borders, going there gently, knowing you have always been there. This is what we are asking for, to be able to move past what we can see, feel, taste, touch, and hear with our mortal bodies, toward a new horizon, a new reality, a kingdom you are imagining, O Christ, and inviting us to imagine and embody with our hearts, hands, and feet as we follow you. Let us go forth this day in harmony with you, compassion in our hearts, gratitude in our thoughts, generosity in our deeds, justice as our passion. Let us go forth carrying God's image into our hurting world at our borders. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so again, thank you for this invitation to speak here about what our Bishop Michael Hunn, calls the Borderlands in all its complicated, beautiful messiness. And although the media, you don't hear much about it right now, they've stopped covering the asylum seekers and even the building of the wall and things like that. I guess there are other things to cover here in D.C. And those being turned away at our borders and those being held in custody at our borders, we are still helping because that's what Jesus has asked us to do. So the first thing I'd like to share with you is what we're thankful for down at the border. The first thing we're thankful for are your prayers. The prayers that come from individuals, from dioceses, from churches, and from religions of all different types. Because when I talk with families at the border and meet people there, and I say, I know a lot of people are praying for you, they are visibly shook, because all of a sudden they say, oh, people know we're here, because this is, for them, it's scary. And so your prayers are most welcome. Secondly, we give thanks at the border for many types of in-kind donations that people have. We have at the Santa Fe Bridge in El Paso. This is a bridge where the main crossing is for families, for individuals who are trying to seek a safe place and secure place to live. And people are nervous because they don't want to miss their number being called. So these families are living in the streets. And so some of the in-kind donations, we set up stations with diapers, with feminine hygiene products, and with water for people to have there. And it's really a place of joy because of the families that are there. I know that might be hard to understand, but so for instance, I was there, 2 weeks ago, and there's a lady by the name of Christine who is on sabbatical from the Diocese of Massachusetts, and she was down there, and she just walks the streets with people and everything. And so when we were there, she got all the children around her. There must have been about 40 or 50. And she passed out these rubber gloves, and they played a game with the rubber gloves. And then she passed out garbage bags, and each child went up and down the street where people are collecting garbage. And the families there really watch out for one another, because that's what they have to do as they wait for their number to be called. And so the numbers in our shelters fluctuate depending on the rumor mill. If they hear there's been a change in policy, they immediately leave the shelters, rush to the Santa Fe Bridge, or they rush in Ojinaga, which is closer to where I live, and wait anxiously and eagerly for their number to be called. We also give thanks at the border because it changes almost daily. Policy changes come down, that affects what we do, how we respond, and people have come down there. People in our diocese, for instance, at the drop of a hat will do whatever they can to figure out what the need is and then meet that need. So at a time when, for a while, ICE was taking people from where they picked them up and dropping, anywhere from 50 to 100 people at the bus stop in El Paso. No instructions. They had confiscated all what the U.S. government considers dangerous materials. That includes Bibles, rosaries, socks, wallets, water bottles, and they just drop them off there. And so what we had to ask people to do, and we means the whole faith community, and it's not just Christian faith, it's not just a particular denomination, but it's Muslims, Jewish faith, because no one can deal with this on their own. And its numbers are just staggering. And so what happened was, when they drop them off, fortunately we have a good relationship with some of the Border Patrol. They will call us and say, we're going to drop off 59 people, and so we get a bus. We drive them up to Albuquerque, which is about a 6-hour drive from El Paso. We put them in our retreat center, the Diocesan Retreat Center, and then this whole community of people from Albuquerque surround them. They make sure they have showers, they make sure they meet with doctors and dentists. I'd say 95 to 98% of the people who are brought, for instance, to Albuquerque, they don't want to stay there. They're looking to get with family or friends, and so trying to explain to them how to get on a bus. They know how to get on the bus, but usually the bus makes a number of stops, so we have to give them cards to say where they're going, and so they can see at stop 1, you get off here, you look for this bus number, things like that. And so we send them on their way. But people, at the drop of a hat, if something changes at the border, all of a sudden we get phone calls and we get people coming, say, what can we do? What are the needs? How are you going to respond? Those kind of things. The other thing we get thanks for at the border are people who choose to write their representatives in Congress. We can treat the results of immoral and bad policy with humanitarian efforts, and we do that all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What we can't do is change a policy, and when you have people on both sides of the aisle who are saying our immigration system is broken, and we write them, you got to sit down at the table together. You got to talk about this and change it, because the system has created the humanitarian crisis that we face right now. And it's so people who take time to write your representatives are most appreciated. So what I want to share with you is a story about how I got involved and what shaped how we respond to people and the situation at the border. And I want to use as an introduction a quotation from Martin Luther King. In his final sermon, the night before he was assassinated, he talked about the Good Samaritan stories and the dangers of the Jericho Road. He said, it's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive to ambushing. And then he went on to say, and so the first question the Levite asked was, if I stop to help the man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. King said, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? So this is what happened to me. We live in far west Texas, which is the closest big city is El Paso. It's about 3.5 hours away. Odessa, Midland, maybe 3 hours away. But we're out in the middle of nowhere. The Diocese of the Rio Grande, which I'm part of, we have the longest stretch of border of any of the Episcopal dioceses on the southern border. And where I live, we have the longest stretch of border that the Big Bend sector covers of all the different sectors. And so there's a lot of land to be driving around on. And we are out in the middle of nowhere. And there are 5 churches that I work with, one in Marfa, Texas, one in Alpine, Texas, one in Terralingua, Texas, one in Lajitas, Texas, and one in Fort Stockton, Texas. And all these are impacted by borderland issues and ministries. So we live in Alpine, Texas, which is about 30 minutes away from Marfa, Texas. And I was driving one morning early, the sun wasn't up, and know that in between Alpine and Marfa, because of the mountains that we drive through, there's not a whole lot of cell service. In fact, there's none in certain parts. And so I was driving along and got flagged down by someone. I didn't know who it was at first. And so I pulled over, and it turned, and you have to understand, in far west Texas, animals think they have a right of way on the road. And so this man had hit a javelina and it completely crushed in the front of his truck. It turns out, when I got out of my car, the first thing I heard, he says, "Don't worry, I'm a federal agent."
Oh, wow.
I said, "Oh, okay." And so he comes up to me and he explained to me the javelina, which he hit, and he showed me his truck was pretty much the Borderland truck, Border Patrol truck was pretty much crushed. So he said, "Can I get a ride?" And of course, I gave him a ride, and we were driving the rest of the way to Marfa. And in that time, in the course of the conversation, I started asking him some questions about what's it like to be in the Border Patrol? What's it like when your policies keep changing, not because you've done anything, but you're caught in the middle? And as we started driving along, he started crying, because it is such a painful place for a lot of these agents to be. He said it, and I'll just give you a couple different quotes. He said, for instance, we have two jobs in the Border Patrol. One is to save lives, and the other is to arrest people. We want to do the first one, and everything. And he went on to talk about that when 2011 came along, there's this big recruiting process for Border Patrol agents. And what they were looking for were agents who would deal with terrorists and drugs coming into the country. And he said what they were advertising for were Rambos. He said, now what we need are Mother Teresas. We don't need Rambos anymore. And so a lot of the Border Patrol people, including my friend, said, I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't trained to deal with families. All of a sudden we've got families, we've got numbers, and he says when the separation issue came along, he said he couldn't even go home for 3 nights to his own family. He felt so guilty about what he had to do, and he knew some of these people because he was originally from El Salvador. And so by the time we finished our ride and everything, I said, well, what do you want? He said, I want people to see me for who I am and not the uniform I wear. And I want to be able to tell people my story. I said, okay. And, so then the next day, the very next day, I had a man come to the church who was an immigrant, actually a refugee from Honduras. And we started talking, and there are some issues in Marfa that we were talking about, which I won't go into detail at this time. But as we were talking, I asked him about what that was like to cross thousands of miles of desert and things like that. And he started crying and proceeded to talk about what that was like and how people saw him as some terrible, horrible person, and he's really not. He wants what everybody wants, a safe place to live and to be able to make a living and everything. And so he started crying, and at the end of our conversation, I said, well, what do you want? He said, I want people to see me for who I am and not where I came from. So the next day, I got my Border Patrol friend in, my friend from Honduras. They sat down in my office and cried together as they realized how they saw someone was not who each other was. And so what we try and do in the Diocese of the Rio Grande is get people to tell their stories, to listen to one another, to share those stories, and in the process of hearing that, getting them what they need and where they need to go. And there are ways to do things on this side of the border, and there are ways of doing things on the other side of the border. And first and foremost, what we try and do is foster a sense of understanding. We listen to people's stories, and so we listen to the Border Patrol. We have, at least in the sector I'm in, these women and men are really compassionate, unlike what the media might show. And in some of the other sectors, they're not as compassionate because the pressure is a little different than where we live. We listen to people who are seeking asylum and or are being deported back, because now we have shelters on both sides of the border. So along the diocese, the Rio Grande, which covers all of New Mexico and far west Texas, there are many ways to wrap our arms around the many different people and situations. We have shelters in Ojinaga, which is in Mexico. We have shelters in Juarez, which is in Mexico. That's right across the river from El Paso. We have an active ministry at the Santa Fe Bridge, helping people try and, work with them, give them hope, find out what their needs are again, and help to provide their needs. We work with a women's co-op in Palermo in Mexico. And then there are two umbrellas, so to speak. What I'm talking about right now is an umbrella that has to do with asylum seekers and everything else. The other umbrella is we do a lot of work at the border that has technically not much to do with the asylum seekers. So right now, we go across the border at Boquillas. And the only way to get to Boquillas is by boat. It's a rowboat. You go down there and they row across and pick you up, and we call it the International Ferry. Okay, and so we go across, and we are currently putting in solar panels in some of these remote villages that have no electricity. And we put solar panels on their schools and in their churches. And it's amazing because the people in these villages, they don't want us to come in and do it. They're glad for our help, but they want to do it and want us to work with them. So we figure out what they need. We talk about where things need to be built, and then we do it. We also we were given a generous grant from UTO. I don't know if you have the UTO offering. Yeah. So we received a huge grant this year for a bilingual youth ministry that stretches from Marfa, Texas, down the 67 corridor, which is the main highway, into Ojinaga. And so what's happened because of how the latest policy is, ICE takes about 25 to 30 unaccompanied children, usually between the ages of 10 and 17, drop them off, push them across the border. And so because of our relationship with the Border Patrol, they'll tell us we've got these kids coming, because if we don't take them to the shelter we operate, the drug cartel will take them and deal with them. And so that gets into human trafficking, and it gets into drug running and things like that. And so this bilingual youth ministry, now we go down to the shelter in Ojinaga, and we have to do several things. A lot of the children that we get right now were separated from their families. So we have to try and find their parents who have been deported. The government did not keep track of who was who and where they went afterwards. And so we're getting pretty good at trying to track down parents, because they're not going back to where they came from, because that's why they were at the border in the first place. And so through this, we've got youth ministering to youth across the border that are looking for their parents or have no place to go. And so we have one orphanage in Ojinaga that we work with, and then we're slowly getting some parents, some families, foster type family situations, until we can find their children. So about every 2 weeks, 25 to 30 teenagers get dropped off, and our government says, see you later.
Every 2 weeks?
Yeah. Yeah. So all of this goes on. So what it's done is created opportunities for people. What are we doing? One is we have developed, or almost finished developing, a pilgrimage where individuals and churches can come down, experience the border. Where I live in the Big Bend sector, which they go into Boquillas and beyond in these small villages. They'll come out, they'll go to Presidio in the United States, to Ojinaga, deal with the borders there. The two shelters we deal with, one in Ojinaga, one's for indigenous people who work in the fields, and the other is for people anyway connected with the asylum process. Then they'll talk with Border Patrol, they'll talk with families and everything. Then we go to El Paso and Juarez, and again, there are a couple shelters we deal with there, and they talk with families and everything. And then we go into Columbus and Columbus, New Mexico, Mexico. And so they get a feel for everything that's there. Our hope is by the time they finish that pilgrimage, which is 5 to 6 days, they have a sense of what's going on at the border, because it's not the way the media portrays it. It's really filled with people who are seeking hope, who are seeking ways to be safe, and there's a fluidity, at least where we are, on the border. People come across. Someone mentioned they saw us on TV where there's a...
Yeah, in the trumpet, yeah. You know, that picture that you have of on the border with someone in the water? Yeah.
Yeah, that's us.
Is that you?
Well, it's us. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's called Voices from Both Sides, and it's Lajitas is where they shut the border down, but people, you can, on good days when the river's low, you can walk across. And so we still have children from Mexico cross over, go to school in Terlingua, and then cross back over. And so we have this thing, it's a Saturday before Mother's Day called Voices from Both Sides, and they set it up in the on the Mexican side. They put a stage and huge speakers. On the U.S. side, they put a stage and huge speakers, and they alternate between music groups singing and everything. And but the whole day they have to begin it with the Eucharist in the middle of the river. And so this year, Bishop Hunt and I and some other lay people from the Episcopal Church were in the middle of the river celebrating the Eucharist and inviting people to come from both sides, which they did. The Border Patrol they know about it, but they kept their distance. They weren't there to intimidate anybody. They were just there. And so by the end of the day, everybody makes traditionally this big hand-holding chain across the border and everything. But if you ever want to come down, it's a Saturday before Mother's Day, please, we'd love to. I could find you a place to stay and everything. So,
which Mother's Day? The Mexican Mother's Day or the
United States? Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
It's in May then, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's in May. So that we have this pilgrimage. The first one will officially start after Easter, the week after Easter. Another thing we do is we take youth groups across and work with the youth in these villages. We paint churches, we paint schools, they help put up the solar panels and everything. And the youth in these villages, they insist on working with our youth. They look forward to talking to them, to learning from them, and vice versa. The other thing that's happening in some of these small villages, as people from the south, the triangle of countries there, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, come forward and they realize this is not going to happen overnight, if at all. They are starting to show up in these villages in the remote part of where we are. And so we work with them and trying to figure out how to get them to be productive, because they just don't want to come and live off everybody else. And so we're working with these small villages. We're also this year going to be celebrating La Posada, which is especially meaningful at the border as these families. It's the story of Jesus and Mary and Joseph trying to find a place at the inn. If you're not aware of that.
Oh, yeah.
And so the people at the border, this is meaningful because they're trying to find a place to live. They're trying to find an inn to stay at, and they bear Jesus within themselves. So this becomes a really powerful liturgy and celebration at the border, on the streets in El Paso and Ojinaga. We also are always looking for in-kind donations of any type. Especially right now, we have a blanket drive. We had a number of people who froze to death at the border last year. So we are especially trying to, I know you're seeking blankets here, and that's great. I wouldn't send them down to us, but because everybody needs blankets. So, but I just want you to know what's going on there. Also, again, diapers, feminine hygiene products. The other thing we're doing in the shelters in Juarez is a lot of people there, when they get their number or they get their date for court, it's usually between 8 months to a year and a half before their date to even appear in court shows up. And so a lot of these people, they're not looking for handouts, but they don't know what to do. So we've established, we put out a call. We got 35 sewing machines, and they're going to be making clothes, and we're looking for some specialty sewing machines and everything. But because they need money to live off of, no matter where they end up. Also, the winter season is coming, and so we have taken it upon ourselves to feed people in our shelters and everything, and that comes to about $3,000 a week in all the shelters. The other two things that we are in need are people, especially lawyers, immigration lawyers. Let's see, 97% of all people who go in front of an immigration judge without a lawyer are denied entry into the United States. When they have a lawyer, it's almost the opposite. And so, but the problem is, when the people come to the border, they're given, well, with the new policy, no one comes across. The Border Patrol stands right on the border and will not let anyone in until they've sought asylum in another country and been turned down. Unfortunately, there's no system in Mexico set up for that. Mexico say, oh yeah, we'll grant them asylum, but they have no process right now. And so it's a mess. And so what our government does, or the courts, they will give people a list of lawyers to call. All the lawyers so far that I know of that can call say, well, we don't go into Mexico. So first of all, they're not going to come and talk with them. Secondly, usually they say, we don't do this, even though we have a list of about 30 to 35